You're listening to Feathers, a podcast of stories about God speaking and his people having just enough faith to believe him and obey. I hope these stories inspire you and encourage you to take flight in your own faith. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, and this is Season 2, Episode 7. Well, hey friends, and welcome to this week of Feathers. I am so excited that you are here. I am so excited about our guest today. Our guest is Bethany Haley Williams. She is the founder and executive director of Exile International. It's an organization that exists to restore Africa's former child soldiers and children orphaned by war. With a PhD in counseling, psychology, and master's in clinical social work, she is a leader in the specialized field of war-affected children rehabilitation with worldwide organizations such as the United Nations and the Global Trauma Recovery Institute. With more than 20 years of experience in the field, Bethany maintains a small counseling and coaching practice in Nashville, Tennessee. She and her husband, Matthew, reside in Nashville and lead the work of Exile International together. So let me just give you a little behind the scenes of the podcast. For the majority of the podcast episodes, I have simply reached out to bloggers that I have connected with to see if they have a story to share. There's some people that I already know the story that I want them to share, or perhaps I've read a book that I want the author to come share about. But the majority of it, 99.9%, is people that I've reached out to personally. So what's been interesting is, as we've gone, is that there have been PR agencies that have reached out to me to see if I want to interview their authors about a new book that they're launching. And honestly, most of the time I end up saying no because it's not a really good fit, or I've never heard of the person. I just really want it to be an authentic conversation. But this one about Bethany and her new book, The Color of Grace, came by my email, my inbox, and I just knew I had to say yes. I was not familiar with Bethany. But they sent me a copy of the book, and I am telling you, you must read this book. It is a must-read book. She shares the story of going from a woman who was in a bad marriage, ends up getting divorced, ends up in depression with post-traumatic stress disorder, gets to the point where she's suicidal, feels like her life is over. And then the steps that she crawls out of that through a fight, and God begins to call her to Africa and to help the children that have been affected by war there. She ends up starting the Exile International that I just told you about. And it's just amazing to me to see the healing that God can bring when we submit ourselves to him, and out of faithful obedience, we say yes to whatever the next step is. So it was just an absolute joy to read that book, and then to know I was able to chat with her, get her to, in her own voice, be able to talk about the stories she shared in the book. And you will see what a delight she is. I'm just so honored to be able to share her story on this podcast, and hope you enjoy it too. You guys stick around to the end of it, and we will talk about some next steps I'd love for us to take as a group of Feathers podcast listeners. So here's my conversation with Bethany. Well, Bethany, welcome to Feathers today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am ridiculously excited for you to be here. How about you introduce yourself, the work you do in your ministry?
Sure. My name is Bethany Haley Williams, and I am the founder and executive director of Exile International. And we have the privilege of providing art therapy and holistic rehabilitative care to rescued child soldiers and children orphaned by war in the Congo and in Uganda.
Well, I have to be honest, before you guys contacted me about being on the podcast, I was not familiar with your ministry, and I read, for those listening, Bethany has a new book out, The Color of Grace. I did say that right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, The Color of Grace, and I read it, consumed it, I should say. I consumed it probably within a day, and it really is the story, Bethany's personal story that she's going to share today from her own trauma, and then how it led into this ministry. So I actually would love if we could just jump right into you sharing the story, how Exile International came about and what's going on with it today. I am just astounded by what I read in the book, and I just don't think a lot of people know what has happened, what's going on, and very excited to offer this platform to give some awareness to it. So can you take us back really to where your personal story, I think, starts all of this?
Sure. It actually started so I'm a counselor, I have a master's in social work, a doctorate in psychology, kind of supposed to have it all together, but clearly no one has it all together. But the book kind of starts out talking about my own journey through trauma and a long, very difficult marriage that ended in a divorce, making some broken decisions out of broken places and struggling with shame, really wrestling with how to forgive myself, how to forgive others, and just really thinking my life was over. I'd given up on myself and never dreamed God could really ever use me again. Became suicidal, actually, at one point, and found myself in a treatment center, and I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the depression was pretty overwhelming. I kind of describe it like it felt like emotional suffocation a lot. And I couldn't shake it off. I didn't really know, where to turn. And this is even after years of being a counselor and having experience.
I was going to say, you would know all the signs and you would think you would know what to do. But I think when you're experiencing yourself, it's something totally different.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think you can become so immersed in it that you still need a hand up. You still need somebody to walk you through it, and you don't think clearly a lot when you're at that level of depression and emotional pain. So I went to a treatment center, and it was actually so I paid for part of the treatment center by selling my car. Really deeply in debt at that point after the divorce. And I walked to the nearest church after it was the last Sunday of the treatment center, and I was in Dallas. I walked to the nearest church to worship on a Sunday, and there was a man speaking, and he'd survived the Rwandan genocide. And he was talking about how God had used his pain to start a ministry for other survivors of war, to provide reconciliation work and forgiveness work and some trauma work as well. So I kind of felt like God just started stirring something in my soul. I'd been praying for God to use my counseling skills and my love for Africa, my love for mission work, and also my journey through trauma in one place. So I talked to him afterwards, and I said, well, what happens to the children? Because my heart has always been drawn to children. And he said, there aren't that many programs out there at all for the kids, and they just kind of get lost in war. And so fast forward a couple of years, I actually went to the Congo for the first time with the organization that he founded. And it was then that my world was just rocked because of what I had seen.
And can you share with the listeners kind of the background of what you saw and kind of where they got to that place? Because I think that's where, maybe in our American culture, we shield ourselves sometimes to what's going on in other parts of the world. So could you give a brief background of what you saw and maybe how that came about?
Sure. So the Congo is known for, they've been in war off and on and violence off and on for 100 years or so. And there are multiple rebel groups there. There are about 30 documented rebel groups. And something that happens often is the children are kidnapped and used as soldiers, used as porters, used as slaves, as cooks for the rebel army. So just in the areas that we work in at Exile International, we work in northern Uganda and we work in the Congo. And there have been around 100,000 children that have been abducted just in those two areas. So I had heard about child soldiering, but I'd never seen it at a personal level, of course, but it was on that trip that I met children who were rescued child soldiers. There were some boys at an orphanage that we visited who asked me to be their mom and asked me, to help them. And some women who tried to give our group their children because they knew that they would have a better life outside of this war zone that they were in. The Congo is also kind of known for that rape is used as a weapon of war often in the violence there, and that also includes young children and young girls. And we were able to meet some of these girls who had been pretty brutally raped at ages, below 7.
Oh my gosh.
So it really wrecked my world, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't really have a place for it in my head. So I came back really just weeks after I came back from that trip, and I started Exile International with the thought that just something had to be done, and my heart was trauma care, and I met children on that trip that were just so traumatized I couldn't even speak. So it started out with the vision of just providing emotional care to these children. And then I quickly realized that most of them have been orphaned, and so they didn't have anybody to provide education or food or clothing. So we started standing in the gap and providing those resources as well.
One thing that you talk about in the book is that these children come back, but then they're rejected by their family.
Right. So, and this happens in the Congo, in both the Congo and in northern Uganda. Once a child is kidnapped and they're trained how to fight, they're given a gun, they're forced to kill. What that also means is sometimes they're forced to kill their fellow villagers, and even sometimes they're forced to kill their family members, which is even hard to say or even comprehend. So if they escape, they come back home, but a lot of times the villagers see them as what they call little rebels. And so they reject them, and a lot of times these kids then either become street children or they're forced just to take care of their younger siblings by themselves. So we work with kids who have actually built their own huts at 12 and 13 years old because no one was there to take care of them.
Wow. And so you guys are stepping in to that gap.
Yeah, we work with local leaders on the ground, and we work with the UN. The UN rescues the children, and our commitment is just to be parents to these kids, or to provide whatever we would provide for our kids. Then we realize that's what these children need. So we really believe when a child has been orphaned, just, especially in the middle of violence, that it's the church's responsibility to step into that gap and to care for these children as if they were our own, because that's really what God does for us.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back a little bit in your story. On this podcast, we talk a lot about faith and obedience, and I know you, after your divorce, was suffering quite a bit and really had the feeling that your life, your ability to serve God, your usefulness was over. Can you speak to that and maybe encourage some people that might be in that point of their story?
Definitely. I remember a time sitting across from my mom, and I said, Mom, those people who just never get over it, who experience something so traumatic and they're just never the same, like they're kind of gone emotionally. And I said, I think that's going to be me. Like I don't think I'm going to be able to overcome this. And to think about that moment, and then to think about everything that God has done and how healing time is, and how really you just have to take one step at a time. And it starts with reaching out for help and knowing that it's going to be a fight. For me, it wasn't this grand moment where I went to a treatment center. I came out whole and healthy. It was years of fighting. It was years of living and learning and doing it wrong, and learning how to become a healthy person. And I'm still learning how to do that. I think we all are. But yeah.
You talked about, though, I think even sticking scripture in your pocket and just repeating healing things to yourself.
Totally. Yeah. There was one time I took sticky notes and I put them all over my house, even at the door. And they were just, I think it said, it won't be this bad forever, or it happened, it's time to move on, or and I would change them up according to what I needed to know or what I needed to tell myself at the time. I would take index cards and I would put them on my dashboard just so I would read them multiple times a day. And some of them were scriptures, some of them were sayings, but I just, it was like I needed that pounded into my head. I would even buy cards, because I kind of felt like, I guess everyone had given up on me, but I knew God hadn't given up on me. So I would buy cards, the kind of those cheesy Hallmark cards.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would think, well, if God were here, this is probably what he would be saying to me, but I need to be reminded of it. And so I would sign God's name, and I would keep those cards with me. And then I would read them as if they were from God. And that those little things just kind of kept me going and kept me from giving up and kept me from hurting myself, really.
Oh, my goodness. And you talked about, I think, somebody, or it was you or somebody had just said, let him love you. And that seemed to be where you were in your journey, is learning that he loved you and how he does that. Mm-hmm. I love that with the cards. Oh, my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really struggled with forgiving myself and then just allowing God to forgive me, or just accepting that love from him because I didn't feel like I deserved it. So when I realized really your only job right now is just to let him love you and let him be tender toward you. And that was very healing for me.
I love that. The other part of your story I was so drawn to is when you have that wrestling, you came back and you described it as you were being wrecked. And you talk about not even being able to come out of your bedroom after that, and just feeling like, and you had shared some of your journal entries. And I remember one part of it was just saying, I will feel this. I'm not going to run from these feelings, and I will do something. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about maybe somebody who has seen something, has been wrecked by something, but doesn't know what to do next? What do you do with those type of feelings?
Well, I think sometimes our natural reaction is that it's just so big and it's so horrific, or the pain is so big that we don't want to feel it. And so we just kind of go on as normal. We watch our TV shows and we listen to the radio and we do work and we do life, and we don't want to feel that. And I think that happens a lot when people come back from seeing really hard things, or even if they're feeling something really hard in their life. And I think that if you do that, then really one thing that I realize is that you're missing what God wants you to feel. So it's in that brokenness and it's in that pain that we really intertwine with the suffering of the cross and the suffering of life. And it's in that suffering and it's in that pain that I feel like God really comes alive and Jesus comes alive. And for me, I just realized that, I'd come back from kind of seeing darkness, and I could either look away from it because it was too big, or I could just look it dead in the eye and to say, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I know that I'm going to play a part in trying to shine light into this darkness. And that, again, was just putting one foot in front of the other.
And I think practically speaking, though, wouldn't you say, if I remember correctly, it looked a lot like research to find out what even was available?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the first things I did after Exile was founded is I started to do research. What's out there? What's being done to help rescue child soldiers in terms of rehabilitation and trauma care? What's working? What's not working? I did a lot of research in northern Uganda, where the LRA had been. There were some programs there for children who had been abducted and children who had escaped and children who had been captives and slaves. And I found out about the beauty of art, dance, drama, and music therapy, and how that really helps the kids come back to life again. So there was definitely kind of it was a deep passion that fueled me. I don't think not doing it wasn't an option, just because I knew something kind of had to be done. And people around me probably thought I was a little crazy for a while, because I was in private counseling practice, had a pretty good income. I'd finally gotten to a point of life calming down a little bit, and then I dived headfirst into this passion, into this ministry. So it was definitely an adventure.
Another thing I am so enthralled with is art therapy. And just on this podcast, I've had this podcast, I guess, since March. And we're currently in season 2. And when I finished up season 1, I guess, at the end of June. And there were the last couple episodes, God just really began bringing art up to the forefront. I talked to one person who had, God had led them to create an art studio in their town in North Carolina. Mm. And then the next week I talked to, and it was kind of, the way the connections happened, led to her, and she had lost her son, and several years later began painting using his supplies. Mm-hmm. And God was just using art in her life. And then the next week, somebody contacted me, somebody who had been a blog reader of mine, and she is actually, God had led her to begin an art therapy career in Australia. And so I got to talk to her. And so when I didn't know it when reading your book, but when I saw that part of your book, I was like, oh my gosh, so you guys use art therapy with the kids. I would love for you to talk about what you guys do and what kind of power that brings in their life. And I know it's even been used, as part of the political process too.
Right. Yeah. So one activity that we use with the children, and this is really powerful for them, but we take handkerchiefs, and we explain that handkerchiefs symbolize capturing their tears, and that God captures their tears in His bottle. So we give them 2 handkerchiefs, one to draw their hopes and their dreams, and then the other to draw their heartache. And then we invite them to draw God in the middle of that story, that narrative, just to remind them that God was with them both in their pain and then also in their dreaming process. And a lot of the kids, dreaming is absolutely new to them because they really thought they would die in the bush and they would die in captivity. And so just to be able to dream about what God would do with their pain and how He can turn that into purposeful living and that they can become peacemakers in their countries, it's really powerful. So a lot of the heartache drawings are full of guns and dead bodies and burning huts, and they draw their story of being kidnapped and being forced to kill and being trained, actually going to a training camp where they are trained how to use a gun and how to fight in the bush, and then their rescue or them escaping, depending on the situation, and them coming to our centers and our programs. And then their dreams sometimes are, I want to be a doctor to help other people or other children because someone helped me when I was wounded in war, or I want to be a counselor because someone has helped me in dealing with my emotional wounds. So art is really beautiful, especially for children, because often children don't have the words to express what they're feeling, and really victims of trauma often don't have the words to express what they're feeling regardless of their age. So it really serves as a catalyst for them to be able to tell their story, which is so healing, just, in the process of trauma care. And then we also use dance and drama therapy. They write songs about what it was like to be in the bush, what it was like to even be raped at young ages, and then how God has rescued them and how God is saving them. And then they sing those songs, which is again very healing for them.
So I want to talk about something else that you mentioned, in that I think we tend to, when these terrible things happen, think to be angry at God. Like, how could you allow a child to be forced to do that, or to be raped? And you talk about in the book how they have found, even through all of this, so much joy and hope. And their viewpoint is, it's not God's fault at all. God is the one that it was with them. And I thought that was so revolutionary, that mindset.
Yeah, it's very humbling to even think of it that way. So what I found personally, and I know this is not the case in every situation or with every person, but I think I've been to 10 different African countries, Haiti, Dominican Republic, a lot of developing nations that have been just wounded. And what I hear whenever I ask, why aren't you blaming God, or are you angry with God? And the response that I hear a lot is, how can I be angry with God? Because God gives us life, and man is the one that brings us harm, or the enemy is the one that brings us harm, which is such a pure way to think of that. But that's a lot of times just their mentality. I think the Western culture sometimes has a little bit of an entitled mentality of we have to blame someone. If something goes wrong, we have to find someone to blame. When in reality, life is life and life is broken. And, sometimes instead of coming back to God to let him hold us in those times of brokenness, we often just want to kind of shake our fist at him and be mad when really at his feet is the place that he can best comfort us. And the kids are amazing in terms of their ability to forgive. The book is just filled with their stories of being able to forgive. And that's part of the program that we work with them with forgiveness. But it's really not hard because, culturally, I just find that, the countries that I visited in Africa, forgiveness is very literal. So there's a story of Judith, and she was forced to participate in the killing of her mom. And, we asked her if Joseph Kony were here, what would you tell him? And she said, I would tell him to come back home so we could forgive him. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, I was walking her back to her dorm, and I said, Judith, how can you do that? Like, how is that even possible? And she just said, because God says so. Because God says to forgive, and that's what he calls us to do. And so we must forgive or the peace will never come. So it's very humbling to think of children who are able to forgive their captors. And we have a hard time forgiving, our mm-hmm. husband because he's not taking out the trash or something like that.
Right. Wow. That's so much we can learn from them. That's so convicting. Mm-hmm. You do it because God said so, mm-hmm. and the peace won't come. Mm-hmm. That's so powerful. I can't even begin. Well, one other thing that I did want to talk about is a story that you shared from one of your journals, and that it was, I believe, a homeless man, that he was outside of McDonald's and he just asked for some coffee.
Yeah.
And I think that, not all of us can go to Africa, not all of us can start, this kind of ministry. What would you say to the person who, is just live an everyday life, has a 9-to-5 job? How can they make a difference like this right where they are? And maybe use that story to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So the story, quickly, is I had just gotten back from the Congo and I'd been really sick, and I'd been in home, and it was my first day out. So I was going to McDonald's to get a Redbox movie to go back and watch it. And I saw a man, kind of beside of the Redbox, and he didn't have any legs. He was in a wheelchair. And, ironically, I'd seen him a year or so before, right before I went on a trip to Haiti in Nashville. And even then I went up to him, a year or so before, and I said, how are you? Can I help you? Because it was raining really hard. And he said, nope, I'm just fine. Everything is fine. And I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, I'm fine. So this was the second time that I'd seen him. So I went over, and it was cold, and I said, are you okay? Can I get something for you? Nope, I'm just fine. Thank you though. And, I said, well, it's cold. What about a cup of coffee? He said, yeah, okay. I think there's 69 cents inside. Maybe if you could get me a cup of coffee. So I went inside and got him a cup of coffee and, prayed with him, and, went back to my car. And I just had this realization that I just lived out the gospel, and it was right down the street from my house, and I didn't have to go all the way to the Congo really to do that. So, I think something we miss sometimes is we feel like we have to do this big thing, or we're waiting for our big calling, which is again kind of a Western, I feel like, mentality, that it has to be big and beautiful and bold. And in reality, opening the door for someone, encouraging your neighbor, getting a cup of coffee for a homeless man, praying with someone, that's living out the gospel, just like in really changing one person's world just by doing small things. And I that's my encouragement really to everybody who wants to get involved in something bigger than they are.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I do want to support your ministry though, because my heart is just broken over these children that have experienced such trauma. What are the avenues and ways that people that might be listening can support Exile?
We love to encourage people to visit our website. Actually, we just kind of revamped that a little bit, but some tangible ways to get involved. One is child sponsorship. So we have a child sponsorship program, and Matthew, my husband, is in Africa right now. And I talked to him yesterday, and he said, every time I come, I'm so convicted with the difference of kids who are able to have ongoing support and to get an education and to be able to wear that school uniform, and kids that aren't. So we have a lot of kids in our peace clubs and our trauma care programs that aren't able to go to school because they don't have a sponsor. We even have kids, whenever it's time for the other kids to write letters to their sponsors, they will actually write a letter to my future sponsor because they just believe that that's going to happen. And so child sponsorship is a great way to get involved. And then we have what's called a restore partner, and we really depend on these folks just to do what we do every day. So these are folks who give $10 a month all the way up to $500 to $1,000 a month, just so we can continue to do what we do on a regular basis and know that those kids can count on us. And we love to partner with churches. We love to partner with businesses. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways to get involved on the website. We're in the middle of something called a Restore campaign right now for 2015. And the kids that we work with, we've doubled the kids that we've worked with in the past 2.5 years. So we have a lot of catching up to do in terms of building a dormitory and finishing some buildings and buying new land. So we're trying to raise $270,000 by the end of the year, and we're halfway there, which is really exciting. So our website is exileinternational.org.
Awesome. And I hope everybody is listening, goes and does something. Help you guys get to that. If people want to connect with you or find your book, Color of Grace, where can they go?
Yeah, my website is BethanyHaleyWilliams.com and then colorofgracebook.com. And then the book is available just pretty much anywhere where books are sold.
And it's wonderful. Oh, my goodness.
Thank you.
So good.
Thank you so much.
I loved it. Well, thanks so much for being here today, Bethany. It's just been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Bethany. I have to tell you that while I was editing this episode, it is the first time in the history of editing any episode that I have cried just listening to it. It is so moving to me. Orphans are just part of my heart. It is part of my passion. And so that just combined into her apparent faith and obedience, it's just almost too much for me to handle. So one of the things that I think is so interesting, I hope everybody caught that, is that art therapy. I can't believe that keeps coming up. So I think that is so cool how God keeps bringing art therapy up. I don't know there's somebody that is listening to this that must need art therapy. Maybe it's me. I don't know, but it definitely keeps coming up. But the big thing that I think that we can take away from her story is for those of you that might be going through something traumatic right now. And what I would like to say to you through Bethany's story is that your story is not done. And in fact, your trauma could be the catalyst to help others once that you are going through the healing process. So do not give up. There is so much hope through Christ for our stories to be redeemed. I love, too, that she really does risk her life going over there as she visits. She pushes past through that and does it anyway, even with the fear. And you can see the joy that she has because of that. And that's just the way God works. It's not easy, but that is where we find true joy, is living out what God has for us. Now, I really would love for us as a group to help out Exile International. I really do want to make an impact, not just hear these things, but to do something about it. So she mentioned that they are going through a campaign right now to raise money. So what I would love to do, I don't know if you have been following my feather story on my blog, but the number 7 is really important in our story. It's actually in biblical terms. It is the number of perfection. And so I would love for us to give denominations of 7 to the Exile International Restore Program. So whether it's $7, $21, $49, $70, if you can give $700, that would be awesome. But I think it would be just so awesome if we could all give after we've heard this wonderful interview and just be a part of the solution for these kids. So do that. The link will be in the show notes over to the giving page. And so I hope you do that. You can see the rest of the show notes over there on featherspodcast.com. be sure that you subscribe over there. You will get an email every time that we release a new episode so you can keep listening with us. So thank you guys for being with us this week, and we will see you next week on Feathers.